the bibliography on the other side, the key text. So if you're interested in social movement theory, then there's some pretty useful information there. In terms of whether we're going to get to any of this session 1, session 2 things is another matter. We're going to play it on a week-by-week basis because, for example, Patricia is coming back next week, so that's going to be an issue. Then it's going to extend into December, but we've really only got 3 weeks because then we've got Christmas problems. So whether we're going to go all the way into January, I'm not quite sure. We'll sort of play that by ear. We've got a quote, session 1. These are things that are going to come up in the first little section. On the other side of that, there's just some general notes from, it says social movements and process on the other side. And that really goes back to the origins of this course, which started off, I think, about 1999 in Wales. I was doing a course called Social Movement and Protest with Professor Graham Day, and this kind of developed from that and been adapted from that. You should also have a sheet which has got the National Animal Interest Alliance, and the difference between welfare and rights, which we'll come to. You should have one that says some animal organisations, which I don't think I've photocopied properly. I think you have to flip it over rather than just turn it around. And you'll see at the bottom of that you've got the Irish situation. And the interesting thing about that is that you'll see that the Irish movement as such is much younger than the British one. There's a couple of gaps because, for example, nobody's quite sure about the Irish Anti-Vivisection Society when that started, and Aaron, there's a dispute. They kind of claim that they were formed a lot earlier than they were, so I just left that blank. And then finally, you've got a definition of social movements, the thing that's put together, which is just kind of for background reading and is quite useful in a way. So, today we're split into two. Normally what I would do is I would do the case study toward the end of a course. On this occasion, I'm going to introduce the case study first because a lot of people here are animal advocates, so I wanted to kind of start with something that we're familiar with. And so it's kind of like an ice-breaking kind of session, and it should last about 35 minutes. Then we'll have a break, or take a question after a break. And then we've got the beginning opening statements about social movement theory as well. So that's the kind of rundown that we're hoping to achieve during today. I think that's the preliminary things I need to say. So this is the case study then. And we start with the definition. This is the definition that I put up on Facebook on the event thing. And this is from a dictionary of sociology, Gordon Marshall. And this is quite a basic definition of a social movement, but it's pretty useful. An organised effort by a significant number of people to change or resist change in some major form of society. Now, what we get even from that very basic thing is a clue to what's going on. First of all, some movements are there to forge change, and other movements are there to resist change. Sometimes they're talking about the same issue. So that's when you then get what's called a movement-counter-movement relationship. Or some people, more academic, would call that the movement-counter-movement dialectic, the relationship between the movement and the counter-movement. A little later in the course, if we get round to it, we should be able to engage with some material by this guy, sociologist called Richard Gale, and he says, forget about the dyad, the two-part thing, the movement and counter-movement. We're looking at a triad, a three-part thing, because we've got a complicated relationship between a movement, its counter-movement, and then the state, or state agencies. And if you think about that then, it kind of explains a lot about what happens in terms of legislation, things getting blocked, things getting repealed, all the kind of things that are going on in England right now, where, Cameron is trying to bring back hunting. There's lots of moves, and there's statements from, say, the police chief saying that they can't police or they won't police the hunting ban. It's not their priority. Just because something's illegal doesn't mean the police will prioritise it. That's usually a kind of social construction, depending on things like the chattering classes and that kind of stuff, you know. So if there's a lot of political kind of clout about it, then they will kind of fess up to it. But if not, there's lots of bits of legislation that is just left to lie, really, and it's almost like ignored. You know? Okay, so this is a good definition to use in relation to the so-called animal rights movement. I kind of do the bunny rabbit ears when I do animal rights because it's a controversial term. The animal rights movement is a phrase that is usually used to indicate people who say they're animal rights advocates, whereas I use a phrase like rights-based animal rights to identify the people who adhere to the philosophy of animal rights. So the animal rights movement, or the animal movement, the animal advocacy movement, is a bit of a philosophical mess. Most of the people in it, even though they call themselves animal rights, are not familiar with and don't adhere to the philosophy of animal rights. So there's a bit of an issue there that we could come to. Probably not so much today, but we'll start to touch on that, and then we'll move on. Okay, Marshall also notes that modern social movements are thought of as groupings, obviously, and organised outside of the mainstream of the political system. So that means that many social movements are interested in the political system rather than being an integral part of it. At the same time, many social movements aspire to what's known in political science as insider status. If you get insider status in terms of politics, then that means you get the ear of the minister or the prime minister or whatever, the tea shop, so you're right there, you actually can bring them up, as it were. When you're the outsider, you tend to be left doing demonstrations and presenting petitions, that kind of thing. So the difference between insider and outsider, we're going to encounter about 3 different types of insider-outsider in this opening statement. But some social movements aspire to insider status. Marshall obviously says that social movements are interested and significant in terms of driving social change. We know, of course, that social movements are purposeful. They have a purpose, and to some degree, at least, they tend to be organised. So much of what we'll say in general terms about social movement theory is going to be relevant to the animal movement as we know it, and as we tend to know it in terms of Ireland, England or Britain, mainland Europe and North America. That tends to be where most of it is, although there's a growing movement in Australia and those kind of areas. The focus is on a movement consisting of several groups and organisations which exists over time, and it experiences the highs and lows of campaigning. When we look at the inner life of a social movement, this is when things get fairly messy. We can expect a fluid and a changing picture. Certainly what we don't tend to find is any sense of linear development. Some of the early theorists assumed that there would be a linear development as though social movements themselves follow some kind of career path. It tends not to be like that. There's more like cycles, and there's kind of troughs and peaks, that kind of thing. Now, according to RUCT, which is Strategies and Action Repertoires of New Movements here, and that's from, what's that? Too far forward. Yeah. So, from 1990. He says that for the social scientist, this level of analysis, the inner life level, is more difficult to theorize because it's messier. Especially if, in theoretical terms, we want to generalize. That's difficult because, it's difficult to generalize across movements. But also, in terms of our little kind of mini course, the more that social movement participants know about their own movement, then the more open they are to reflexivity, thought about it, and the more they're able to actually analyse the movement they're in. And so their movement makes a lot more sense in that sense. So I think that's one of the things that I hope is going to be the most useful thing about this kind of mini course. So we get the sense then that social movements have constituent parts based on individuals, based on organisations, ideas and so on. And quite often we characterise a diverse set of people as a group or as a movement. So the example we give about this is the feminist movement. So Tim Jordan here from 1995 talks about the unity of social movements. He says that feminism is constituted from a wide range of collective actions. And there's consciousness-raising groups, there might be various types of demonstrations, there could be various types of direct action, and include a broad range of opinions on the nature of women's oppression. But then he says this: if it has any unity, that is because all actions somehow address the oppression of women. That's on the quote sheet. So, in that way, we can make sense of a label like the feminist movement. And what scholars have done with that is they've tended to identify at least several types of feminism. And in theory, you could talk about each type as a social movement within itself. But what tends to happen is you talk about different types, and then you've got an overarching idea that they're in a movement, one movement. So you can talk about radical feminists or black feminists, you can talk about Marxist or socialist feminists, and probably the most numerical liberal feminists. And nowadays, we also move on to issues like postmodern feminists or so-called difference feminists. So there's quite a lot of different types of feminists that have been identified, and then there's the argument about whether they are separate movements, whether they're in alliance with each other, or whether they are actually constituent parts of one movement. So using this same kind of idea, this kind of overarching thing, we've got the work of Robert Garner, who's a political scientist, and this is his first major work, Animals, Politics and Morality, and he uses the term the animal protection movement, which is the phrase that I use in my MA as well. And he uses the phrase animal protection movement to include the different mobilisations that variously concern with the well-being of animals in some way. However, what he mainly argues for is that the animal protection movement should be seen to incorporate two broad categories, which he calls the animal welfare movement and the animal rights movement. Both of these broad groups, then, are concerned with the plight of other animals, but they are based on different philosophies, and they're sometimes in conflict. Often their outcomes will be different. What they want, as a liberation versus larger cases, that kind of stuff. They certainly often have different ideas about where they stand in relation to a nation's political system. The former, the welfarists, often act as system insiders. This is very controversial at the moment in the United States. And the people who are familiar with Facebook will know that Bob Linden, for example, is attacking the HSUS at the moment for its partnership with the egg industry and everything else. So often they will work as insiders. In the UK, you would have examples like Compassion Animal Farming doing that. The latter, the animal rights movement, again, running right at the ears, are often and sometimes reluctantly outsiders. Many in the rights grouping tend to reject conventional politics altogether, and then they focus on cultural change. So their audience, quite often, is said to be the general public and not politicians. And there's also some degree of that kind of thing with the media as well. Some animal advocates will retreat from all of that and won't get involved with any of that. They'll concentrate on physically rescuing other animals and causing what they call economic sabotage towards the industries that they label the animal abuse industries. There are other animal mobilisations as well. These you could regard as movements in their own right, or they could be part of the bigger movement. Some take a rights or welfare line, or they suggest that you can mix and marry the two. So, for example, you've got anti-vivisectionists, you've got factory farm opponents, anti-intensive farming advocates, people opposed to hunting, the anti-blood sports lobby, the activists against zoos. Some people specialise in work against circuses, and there are some people who campaign almost exclusively against fur. So the groups that tend to specialise tend to reveal that specialism within their name. So you've got the, I don't know if you can see it there, the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, the Irish Anti-Vivisection Society, both animal experimentation of course, the League Against Cruel Sports, the Irish Council Against Blood Sports. Then you have other groups which are more generic, and they tend to campaign on many fronts at once. So in the UK you have Animal Aid, and in Ireland you have the Alliance for Animal Rights and the National Animal Rights Association. To add some confusion to the idea of movement, some people would include conservation organisations as part of the animal movement, or at least a movement which is to do with the well-being of other animals. Then on top of that, you have the animal use industries, which is a separate category. Now, the animal use industries, they make a big claim about animal welfareism. They say that they're part of the animal welfare movement, but more than that, they claim to be the authentic voice of animal welfareism. So, by claiming the authentic voice of animal welfareism, they will attack the entire notion of animal rights. But they may support some animal welfare groups that we might recognise as animal welfare groups, but they will also attack and criticise some planks of the philosophy of animal welfareism. For example, Peter Singer's animal liberation position, they will attack that, and also they'll deliberately label that animal rights, whereas in actual fact it's not an animal rights position. So, most of that can be seen in this book, which is Harold Gouthier, and it's called Animal Rights, and the subtitle History and Scope of Radical Social Movement. And so he says, through educational efforts with their members, this is the kind of counter-movement or pro-use movement, and to the general public through media, they are challenging and attempting to discredit the animal rights doctrines and beliefs. That's on the quote sheet. So he cites farm animal coalitions, that is groups that agree with farming of animals. He also talks about fur coalitions, and he also talks about defenders of animal experimentation. Just let me give you some idea of the kind of groups we're talking about here. Under the name Farm Animal Welfare Coalition in North America, you have the following groups. The American Dairy Science Association, American Farm Bureau Federation, American Feed Manufacturers Association, American Meat Institute, American Society for Animal Science, American Veal Association, Animal Health Institute, Commission on Farm Animal Care, Farm and Industry Equipment Institute, Holstein Association, Livestock Conservation Institute, Livestock and Marketing Association, National Broiler Council, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, National Broiler Council again, I don't know why that's in twice, National Lamb Feeders Association, National Livestock and Meat Board, National Livestock Producers Association, National Milk Producers Federation, National Pork Producers Council, National Turkey Federation, National Wood Growers Association, Poultry Science Association, Provimi, I don't know what that is, and the United Egg Producers. These are the constituent parts of one lobby group in the States. And it says here, in addition to those industry groups, the US Department of Agriculture is also listed as a member. So, if we want to get some idea of our opponents and the strength and size of them, well, that kind of gives it. What Tom Reagan does, he talks about the American Medical Association. This is in his Empty Cages book. And he talks about how they operate. He says, a steady stream of press releases, memos, email messages, press conferences, and web statements, miscellany, denouncing ARA extremists, animal rights advocate extremism, that means, and lauding reasonable animal welfareists have flowed from the AMA and other biomedical research industries, public relations office, straight into the hands of reporters, news directors, and editors. So there's a big effort to discredit the idea of animal rights and to also differentiate it from a particular type of animal welfareism. So that brings us to your handout. So I don't know whether we want to go through this, but you can see that. But this is the National Animal Interest Alliance. The name itself is quite interesting because they suggest that by being used, that is in the best interest of other animals. And so, we just pick out a couple maybe. Animal welfare is a philosophy that promotes stewardship of species and individual animals, embraces a human connection to the earth and animals that recognise humans as part of nature, blah, blah, blah. At the bottom, rejoices in the bond between animals and humans. What they say about animal rights is this. The animal rights is a political movement that opposes all animal use and most traditional relationships with animals, including eating meat, wearing leather or wool, biomedical research, owning pets, breeding dogs and cats, circuses, zoos, hunting, trapping, ranching, fishing, and learning about animals by hands-on experience. Goes through all that. And then for some reason, there seems to be some name check right at the bottom for very right here, because it says, works for the day when people view animals from afar, which is quite interesting. So as you can see, a completely different version of things. The National Animal Interest Alliance claim that they're interested they're dedicated to explain to the public the, quote, critical difference between animal welfare and animal rights. So the animal rights movement as we know it will see this group as part of the counter movement. Okay? If we remember the recent prime time about fur a couple of weeks ago in Ireland on RTE, the language that the fur growers were using is very similar to the language of this group and other groups in North America and other groups in England and one or two groups in Ireland. And they'll be saying things like, well, what these people want is a meatless, petless society. That's the kind of slogan that they come up with. If we're looking for insiders, counter movements in the UK, we've got the National Farmers Union, Seriously Ill for Medical Research, the Research Defence Society on animal experimentation, the British Field Sports Society, which is probably now subsumed under the Countryside Alliance, and then you've got specialist groups like the British Association for Shooting and Conservation, which used to be called the Wildfowlers Association of Great Britain and Ireland. In Ireland, you've got RISE, which kind of tends to cover all that, and there's been a concerted effort to bring all these groups together in order to kind of do for Ireland what these groups tend to do elsewhere. Going back a little bit, I said that some people would include conservation groups in the animal advocacy movement. Theoretically, they can be separated from the animal protection movement. One or two typically get included. Sometimes Greenpeace International might be, but certainly Sea Shepherd, it tends to be included as part of this movement, even though Paul Watson says that Sea Shepherd is not is not an animal rights group, and just look at the name, it's called Sea Shepherd Conservation Society. So how can all this be separated? Just very briefly, in terms of conservation, their concentration on species is the key, whereas animal rights proper would be concentrated on individuals. That would make a difference, especially the rights-based animal rights, which would see individual other animals as rights bearers and what we do to them as rights violations. Examples that I could think of about this, when I was in Wales, there was proposed cull of grey squirrels to protect the red squirrels on Anglesey, and also there was a large ruddy duck population in Anglesey, and what they would do in the summer, they would go to Spain and they would mate with a white-headed duck. And therefore they would produce a hybrid. One of those situations where two species could interbreed, which is quite rare, but these could. And so conservationists in Wales and in Britain and in Spain were trying to kill or cull the red ducks because they were having sex with the wrong type of, So again, the emphasis is on the species and not the individuals in the species. The animal use industries, like this one, can be separated by the fact of what they do to other animals. They actually use them and they promote using them for food, fibre, and a few other words like that, rather than what they claim to be. So Goodyear then says that these animal use industries are a counterforce to animal rights, and notes that they concentrate their efforts on discrediting the genuine animal rights or animal protection movement. And he even claims that they tend to do that rather than promoting animal welfareism itself. In other words, they're kind of set up just to be an attack, kind of thing, Rottweilers if you like. But they would dispute that. Okay, so just to end this little section then, I invite you to have a look at that one, some animal organisations. And there is a kind of key to this, which kind of puts what I've said into some context, although it would be a controversial context. Essentially, the key would be, if things are in bold, then they tend to be seen as animal rights groups. If things are just in normal, they tend to be seen as animal welfare groups. And the ones that are underlined are the ones where there's the most controversy about which camp they're in. As early as 1809. And like the RSPCA wasn't royal at first until Victoria got involved, which is quite interesting. Then it moves through.
Why do they call them brute animals? Do they?
About higher and lower animals, and it's really, there's a comparison really with sociology. It's embarrassing really, if you get any sociology book which is from the before the 1980s. It's got man, meaning humanity and stuff and all that. Animal advocates still have a problem not calling other animals it, but certainly in those kind of early days they would say brutes, lower animals, dumb
I'm just
animals.
wondering if they're differentiating between wild and farm and domesticated animals in the definition of brute at that time.
Yeah, that's right. And there was a lot of that going on. And then there was the dumb animals thing, which sometimes just meant without language, but also again seems lower. So it's only been very recently that there's been some challenge to all that. In the sense that we are much more careful about our language now. People tend not to talk about other animals as it anymore, but you'll see it often. Facebook posters still do it. People in their general discourse will do it, and sometimes it's quite hard not to, especially if you get a bit fired up. You'll see a lot of people doing it, and that really is a testament to the depth of the culture that we regard other animals as items of property, which is where the it comes from. There is that argument. You see a puzzle, about babies. Sometimes they say, well, we call human babies it as well. Yeah. So the real push towards a kind of linguistic challenge was ironically kind of modelled on the feminist movement. And the classic case there would be in the feminist case of history became his story. As a political thing.
But what do you think in an era prior to domestication, just prior to farming? How are animals conceived? Are they given a female?
Prior to farming completely.
Well, yeah. Just looking back,
I don't
I
know.
know it's
said that there was some kind of matriarchal societies that tended to see other animals as spirit forms. There is an intriguing argument that domestication and the concept of property and the concept of patriarchy developed in a similar kind of way. Now, Engels took this on. It's a bit controversial, but it's an interesting idea, which is that men didn't actually know that they had much to do with the production of babies, because if you think about, you have sex, and then 9 months later, plop, baby. What's that got to do with the sex, right?
Yeah.
And the theory is that it wasn't until we started to farm other animals.
We got into monogamy.
Yes, but no, because then we start to see the relationships then, and pregnancy and this kind of stuff. At the same time, because we were starting to farm them, then that they became items of property. So we started to fence them in, and then the story goes men wanted to hand them down to their sons. And so therefore, that means that they had to know who their sons were. And so the promiscuous horde that used to exist, with everybody shagging each other, as it were, could no longer exist because men wanted to hand down their property to their sons. They wanted to know.
And they had established this because of the animals themselves.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's the kind of story. It's a little bit of a controversial one, but it does kind of it sounds plausible.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it sounds plausible to me, anyway. So.
Yeah.
Okay, now we're kind of at the break thing. Do we want to take a couple more questions, or should we just have a cup of tea now and then get on with the rest of it and then bring it all together at the end? Should we do that? Have a cup of tea?
Sure.
No, okay.
Thank you.
So the way I wanted to work it was that the bit that we've just seen was supposed to be kind of like an opening statement about animal rights, vegan movement, animal welfare, animal advocacy as a case study, which will interweave in the course. And then this is the opening statement about social movement theory. Now, what you'll probably see then is you'll see how the two things match. And when we go through this bit in particular, there's probably lots of it you'll recognise as animal advocates. And you'll recognise it on an organisational level, but you'll also recognise it on an individual level as we go through. Okay, so major developments then in the way that social movements have been theorised or written about. The early theories were often called collective action theories, and they were largely very negative in character. For example, the early theorists of social movements, or mobs, or riff-raff theories, some of them were called, assumed that the fact that someone took part in protest, or the fact that someone went to a demonstration, showed that there was something wrong with them. Okay, so if you were a demonstrator, there was a pathological problem with you. Okay, so this comes from adhering to a social theoretical model, which basically says that society has got mechanisms within it, which means that when it gets out of kilter or out of equilibrium, these mechanisms bring it back into balance or equilibrium. So in that model, there's no real room for social movements, okay, because it's got a self-correction element to it. What we'll see as we progress is that there was a paradigm shift in the way that social movements were thought about and analysed. Certainly in the 1960s, you can obviously think about the birth of second wave feminism, the civil rights movement, and anything else that went on there, the students' movement. This kind of changed everything. Now, one thing it changed was that sociologists themselves got involved in protest movements. And so that means then that the theories that they had hitherto adhered to themselves and been dominant within their field were telling them that they were pathological, right? And so this kind of their own participation gave the lie to those theories that they thought. It could no longer be the case, they thought, that being involved in a social movement meant that you were an irrational individual. They said, well, I'm not irrational, I'm involved, so there must be something wrong with the theory. So, if you were involved in social movement activity, you were suffering from essentially some pathological problem that could no longer be right. And so, out go the old theories, and in come new theories. New theories were required, and surprise, surprise, these new theories found that social movement activists were perfectly rational, they were normal people, and moreover, they had genuine grievances, which society wasn't taking care of.
This was in the 60s.
60s and 70s, yes, that's right. Yeah. Now, it should be said, and we see this, that this development, this change, wasn't universally met with praise, especially, we might say, from the political right, because the idea of being able to label a group of people as irrational was quite useful, but also, more surprisingly perhaps, some people on the radical left are also very critical. Now, that comes in when we start to learn about new social movements. We'll skip that for now. Okay, so it should be noted then that social movement theorists have moved on from the crude ideas about social movements and the people who are protesting them. But, and this is a very important point for us, this does not mean that those negative stereotypes have been eradicated from society, you know. And so if you're wondering why people say, get a job or get a life, you know, often there's something about that. And in fact, the article that you posted, Frank, said that the eight-year-old, right, so exactly that point. Yeah, so that was quite interesting to me. A further development found that not only were modern social movements and their campaigners perfectly rational, they were pretty organised too. So that led to a whole field of analysis, especially in North America, about organisation, about resources, about mobilisation of resources, and that usually comes under the banner of resource mobilisation theory. So we'll kind of touch on that a little bit. Another development, this time associated with European theorists rather than North American ones, started to concentrate on social movements by seeing them as communities, or as little societies, or even imagined communities and societies. And now we've got the notion of virtual communities and virtual societies. Societies or communities that are made up of people who don't really know each other. So obviously, the first thing we're going to think of is the internet and the way that people interact on the internet. They don't know each other, but there's kind of feminists who do that, there's anti-capitalists who do that, there's obviously animal advocates who do that. Recent social movement theory may also see activists engaged in an identity involving, but also an identity transforming phenomenon. And this is quite interesting for us because this is suggesting that when people get involved in social movements, it has a big impact on them. And a lot of people do say that, anecdotally. They say that, you know, by me getting involved with that, you know, I found a new bunch of friends or a new bunch of colleagues, but it's also pulled me away from my old friends and colleagues and maybe even the family. So it does tend to kind of transform you a little bit, and there's quite a lot on that, and that's quite an interesting thing. These later theories then correspond much more with how social movement participants and activists see themselves and what they say about themselves. Obviously, they see themselves as acting rationally, and they see themselves on some level as organising. They might not see themselves as in an organisation, especially not if that organisation is like a business or like a commercial firm. They will probably shy away from that, maybe, but recognise that some organisation is necessary. When it comes to seeing themselves as acting rationally, as might be expected, movements and the counter-movements often level the charge of irrationality at each other. There's almost like a childish kind of bantering that goes on between social movements and counter-movements and counter-movement people. And again, we can see this very clearly. Just have a look on Facebook. The first thing that happens, you know, is that people start screaming at hunters and hunters start screaming at them. And they're basically saying, you know, you're just a bunch of lunatics and all the rest of it. And so there's no real engagement about the ideas. It just tends to kind of be thrown back to those early things, saying that irrationality is involved. So, when we're dealing with modern theories about social movements then we're involved with new social movements. What we'll do in this kind of mini-course, if you like, is talk a little bit and briefly about the difference between old social movements and new ones. We don't have to go into that too much, but we will look at that to some degree. A very recent way of characterising some social movements is by thinking of them as tribes. And in fact, some movements themselves, at least some people within those movements, tend to describe themselves as members of tribes. And perhaps the best known example, at least the best known example to me, is from the early 1990s and the so-called Donga tribe. Now, the Donga tribe effectively formulated the roads protest movement in the UK in the early 1990s. So these were the people who virtually kind of set up villages and towns in woods and forests that were going to be knocked down for building new motorways. And they would build tree houses, they would have walkways between them, they would almost like an entire kind of community there. They would dig into the ground and lay concrete and cover it over so they could lock themselves on and everything. So it was just a way they saw as kind of protecting the earth by actually being in contact with it and stopping the actual diggers and work people doing their job by chaining themselves to their equipment and that kind of stuff. So that's called the Donga tribe, roads protest. And seen obviously as a tribe. Now, in some of the theories, some groups are described as tribes, which we might find quite surprising. For example, the United States gun lobby is sometimes described as a tribe within some of this theorizing. So not all of it will necessarily kind of resonate with us, I don't think. Some recent theories have suggested that a movement such as New Age travellers can be seen as a hybrid phenomenon, and that involves a mixture of things like lifestyle issues, subcultural values, and the notion of being in a movement. So, about 1996 to 1997, when I was doing my MA at Dublin University, myself and a colleague, for our dissertation, we looked at the advent of the so-called New Age traveller. And we did find some of the different elements in it. For example, there were some people who were deadly serious about being New Age travellers. They suggested that the way they lived was a social protest in and of itself, and a major way of protecting the environment. I clearly remember one person being interviewed on the TV, and the interviewer said, "Well, is it true then that your lifestyle is so kind of basic and crude that when you go to the toilet, you walk to the woods, dig a hole, go to the toilet, and cover it over?" And the guy said, "Well, yes." He said, as opposed to going to the toilet and flushing it to my nearest pleasure beach, which is worse, kind of thing. So some people were deadly serious about it. Others were less serious, and they maybe travel just in the summer months, and then they would return to their squats and in Manchester and everything for the winter time, get the old central heating and that kind of thing. And then some of them were just really into the image and the clothing, yeah. And so we ended up, and perhaps this is quite unkind, talking about the latter people. We call them false travellers, because they didn't do any travelling, and they didn't do anything apart from dressing up in the gear, I think. So, that's the way it worked. So these developments, the ones that I've outlined, these shifts, have also followed a pattern which is prevalent in sociology in general. So we're talking about the so-called cultural turn in sociology. The reason this is relevant is because the stress of the cultural turn obviously is on the cultural aspects of society. This is a move away from kind of Marxian, Marxist, economic and materialist analysis, and a move towards more micro-analysis, looking at the particular. So Johnson and Clandemans, you all know your reading list, they explain that social movements are part of society, and yet, as we've said or suggested, they are a challenge to that society too, at least potentially. At least the new social movements can be seen as a challenge, but maybe just to one part of society. So there we see the difference between the old and new, in the sense that the old social movements tended to want to take over the state and change everything, whereas new social movements tend to focus on one particular aspect of society. Societies themselves are cultural, and although there's a great deal of dispute about the term cultural, it's one of the most difficult words to define sociologically, what we're talking about are ideas to do with things like customs and beliefs, and this list here, like values, but also artifacts, symbols, and rituals. So Johnson and Candyman are saying that cultural analysis moves us away from notions of organizations,
or resources, structures, and preconditions. They say that theoretically that's looking backwards, back into the kind of 70s and Marxian ideas. And ahead are the messier insider kind of analysis, looking for perhaps softer factors, as they put it, which means mental and subjective factors that go on in social movements, and also relationships that go on in social movements. The problem for that, as I kind of alluded to before, is that for the researcher, this is quite difficult to research when you're dealing with these kind of issues. The technical term in academia is to say we need to operationalize your research, which means you've got to find a way of measuring variables and this kind of thing. It's quite difficult when you're just talking about subjective values, rather than kind of hard economics or structures, that kind of stuff. So all of this is also about the notion of stasis and change. In sociology in general, we tend to look for those patterns, continuity and change. And that's really the basis of society. It's kind of thing, everything is changing, but everything remains the same. That's kind of what it means. That there are structural elements of society that keep everything very rigid, but everything also changes as well. It's a little bit like you can change the entire staff of an institution, and yet the institution will remain pretty much the same. So stasis and change. Recent analysis suggests then that any particular dominant culture in a society is not as stable as it first seems. And that's good news for social movement participants, because that means that change is possible. I love it when you go to Dundrum and you pay for your parking. The little sign comes with change is possible. I think that's brilliant. I always thought that was great. So change is possible. Things are not as fixed as they might seem. From a distance, societies look very stable. And therefore, a macro, a wide, overarching analysis might suggest stability. Apart from revolutions, or when we're in a kind of pre-revolutionary state, cultures tend to change slowly. It's like a form of evolution, and it often takes a great deal of time. However, social movements are particularly unstable. Movement itself is the metaphor. And so people have theorized that if you're going to get change in society, social movements are very important in that sense, because this is where the kind of mix comes, where the new ideas come, they develop, they flower, and then they spread into the rest of society. So from a distance, social values, social norms, social codes appear stable, and also perhaps widely accepted. And there's a concept in sociology called a value consensus. If you've got a value consensus in society, most people go with the same set of values. Closer up, when you look closer at things, the notion of consensus is much harder to see. Close up, society is full of what Johnson and Clandemans call cracks and fissures. Little cracks in society. The macro view, the wide overall view, renders these invisible, but closer up these cracks can be seen. So, this view suggests that social movements themselves, but particularly social movement activity, is useful to investigate this notion of social status and change. And why? Precisely because social movements are seen as part of society, but also, as we said, often a challenge to it. They are the fundamental source of change. Social movements, therefore, should be the centre of sociology, because they are central, social movements are central to new social politics and new realignments. So these are quite big claims being made for the social role of social movements. Now this comes from the work of Alan Surain, as you see there, but this echoes quite a lot of what Jürgen Habermas would say, which is that, social movements in society are very crucial, not least because they ask questions, they demand answers to questions. And so, therefore, they're very important. So, this cultural analysis is focused on notions like cultural performance, which sometimes reveal this kind of close-up picture, this picture of society which is riddled with gaps, and riddled with inconsistencies, and riddled with contradictions. And the idea is that the activity of social movements can create a set of alternative values. And so some are given here, like in terms of symbols, the hippies or the yippies brought a load of new kind of symbols in, not least the CND symbol and Make Love Not War, these kind of ideas. Languages change as societies develop, and social movements have a role there. Rap music is given there, Rastafarian movement will come in there. And in terms of code, you can think of the punks. So the question for us then, taking interest in social movements, are these the seeds of change that we might like to see, or at least some kind of disruption, some turbulence in society? Because, does that mean then that things are getting a bit shaken up? The more critical thing to say about that is that rather than being seeds of change, what we might see is for these new developments to become taken up by the system. So the system tackles it by incorporating it, emasculates it, commodifies it. So these alternative structures become in some ways bought off. Now, one example we used to give about this, I don't know whether you experienced this yourself, but in the 1970s when the punk movement started, especially in London, what punks would do, going to a gig, would be to buy a roll of bin bags and make their t-shirts out of bin bags. They would just punch a hole in the top, and their arms would come through the sides, and that was their t-shirt for the night. Okay? And obviously it was quite useful for all the spitting and everything that went on. However, within months, Carnaby Street was selling tailored bin bag tops. Yeah. And so that again is the way that the system can try to kind of buy off.
Yeah, I think it was Leonard Cohen said the 60s lasted for 5 minutes before the house was moved in.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so suddenly you get the thing, and then suddenly you'll find some capitalists selling back to you your own values that should, in theory, be oppositional to them, but it doesn't quite work that way. Okay, Johnson and Clandemans, for their part, are saying that social movements can arise from these social cracks, if you like. Another important part.
Can I just ask
Yes.
a question? Are you assuming that a social movement is contrary to capitalism?
I'm not, no, and that would also not fit in with that first definition either, because if you got a movement which was contrary, you probably get a counter movement which, so no. It's not that. I mean, there's some interesting debate in the animal movement at the moment about whether you have to be opposed to capitalism to get what we want. And, David Nybert would say that, Steve Best would say that. A lot of other people say, no, we can have an animal-free capitalism, or a green capitalism. Other people say that the actual structure of capitalism is just impossible. I imagine that creates quite a lot of interesting dialogue within Marxist circles, because a kind of crude Marxist position would say that society is pretty kind of rigid, and that capitalism itself is caught with the contradiction of capitalism. Whereas what we've learned recently, and what the critical theorists and everything did, was they tried to figure out how it turned out that capitalism was much more flexible and subtle than Marx thought it was, And you could be cynical and think, well, it's a few crumbs from the top table, or you can just say that capitalism has turned out to be quite a flexible system and not rigid at all. So does that open up the door for a green capitalism? Is it possible? So some people would, so that'd be an interesting argument. I'd like to see how the Marxists would talk that one through, really. What Johnson and Clandemans are saying is that this idea of processing culture is very important. You might arise from these kind of cracks in social values, but also there's a question of processing culture or asking critical questions about it. The result of that is the creation of subcultures and countercultures. Counterculture being the more important one in terms of bringing about real change. Again, going back to the idea of could the system buy you off, a subculture probably would be a lot easier to buy off than a counterculture. So that would be interesting. So they're suggesting that these social movements consume culture and then they remodel it and they transmute it by adding things, changing things, reconstructing things, and reformulating things in terms of their own values. So in terms of looking at or theorising social movements, it's difficult, at least should be by now I think, difficult to see much of this from the outside. This means that insider research is very interesting from a methodological point of view, and perhaps essential. This is another general kind of sociological problem about the fact that the social scientist is also part of society. So how can they best look at society? Do they do it as insiders, with all the baggage, or do they try and make themselves strangers to their own society and look from the outside? There's a lot of argument about that. What's probably true is that if you're inside a movement, you're going to see a lot more, you probably know a lot more, than any outside observer. At the same time, the outside observer has got that splendid isolation which that kind of objective position is supposed to create. So, in some senses, you might argue that kind of some kind of methodological kind of pluralism and mixing will be quite good there, and you need to look at the literature and see how that would come about. In this course, I think we'll probably end up talking about the inner life of social movements, because we're looking at social movements in a theoretical sense, but also as participants in social movements. Looking at social movements like that has been seen as quite boring. So I'm going to sip of this if you want to use my voice. You say, wait, do it again. I had to get some bleach on this before. Looking at social movements from the inside can seem rather boring. What's really meant by that is that some people think of social movements as being very active, doing things, changing things, revolutionary, and all this kind of stuff. Then you look inside a social movement and you see people attending meetings, addressing envelopes, or used to be, and maybe selling sales goods or giving away badges. So this is often dealt with by a concept called goal displacement. Okay, last one, which is good because I'm losing my voice here. This is more positive, maybe. The inner life of a social movement can be seen in terms of its idioculture. Now, idioculture comes from the work of Gary Fine, which is interesting really because he was taking a kind of micro view when the dominant paradigm was to look at kind of Marxist macro kind of thing. But essentially, he was saying idioculture is a system of knowledge, beliefs, behaviour, and customs. And the suggestion is that these are interactively shared by social group members. This analysis then reflects what someone like Zygmunt Bauman was saying about social life generally. In that, it's claimed that members of society have a reality, experiential reality, which is based on the fact that they're attached to groups, and being in a group is very important for people as social animals. And so the same is said about social movements, that there is a certain experiential reality about being in a social movement, and part of it is their attachment to a group. And this is where that idea of transforming comes in quite interesting, because eventually you kind of identify with your group and you split away from everyone else, and so that's where you get ideas like, vegan sexual and this kind of stuff, and, do you have any friends or meetings, and, when you talk to a meeting, you end up having all those kind of group kind of discussions about your interaction with the general mainstream, because you've kind of, you come together as a group. Suggested then that one member's experience is understood by other members, fairly kind of conventional idea, that they have tools in which to shape and construct social reality based on shared values, and quite understandably, a movement's culture will bring it together, and that means that it gives it cohesion, and necessarily distinguishes insiders and outsiders. So again, that's the third different use of this notion of insiders and outsiders. The extent of a movement's idioculture is ultimately, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, ultimately connected with factors that determine how long the group will last, how stable it will be, and how kind of intense it will be in terms of its interaction. So that's a kind of breaking the ice on the theoretical side of things. And then from now on, I think what we'll do is, when we have our next session, is we'll delve a little bit more into some of the detail going back to the collective action thing. And that goes back to the kind of 1930s. And then we'll rush up to the 1960s and we'll see that big change. So we should get to that in the second one. So that's about it for... Anybody want to make any comments? Ask any
I just
questions?
want to ask a question about, like, is there like it seems to be like the animal protection movement, is there a name that is commonly acknowledged for, it's not the animal rights movement, it's not...
The most common name is the animal rights movement, even though it's misnamed by that. There's a minority of people who agree with that animals have got rights in the sense that's laid out in the philosophy of animal rights. But it's a bit messy because a lot of people go, yeah, I believe that animals have got rights, and then there's a problem then because are you talking about negative rights or positive rights, which again comes back to the counter movements, or are you talking about moral rights or legal rights? A lot of people who misunderstand the movement think that it's based on legal rights and bringing about legislation or bringing the idea of animals as persons, making them legal persons in a sense. Whereas someone like Tom Reagan would say that it's almost exclusively theorizing about moral rights, and what tends to happen there is that moral rights become codified into law and then they become legal rights. So that's how it changes. But the point is, if you focus on legal rights, that puts you straight into the political system, which, as I said, a lot of rights people reject because they think that we're not going to get very far until we've had cultural change first. Yeah. Otherwise, I saw this on Facebook today. Mike Huskinson, well-known anti-gun sports guy in England, he was saying, the police are not acting, they're not enforcing the hunting ban. We've got to do something about it. The real problem with this is that the hunting ban was brought in by speciesists in a deeply speciesist society. We're now expecting speciesists in a deeply speciesist society to police the hunting ban and to arrest people who break the law. But the actual culture goes against us. If we hadn't brought about any cultural change, we've got more of a problem because they don't see it as being that important. Well, it's about animals. You can see police officers going, I've got better things to do than chase around the countryside.
The hunting ban wasn't really about animals, it was about Tories and the caste system in England.
Yeah, some of it was, and the debate about it was quite interesting because animal rights was never mentioned. It was all about pest control, animal welfare, land management, this kind of stuff. The concept of animal rights, philosophical animal rights, didn't come into it. I was in England in those days and took part in loads of debates, including TV things, and animal rights didn't come into it. It wasn't part of it. The guy who proposed it in England, he was a guy who went fishing. He proposed the ban. So, this is the problem. Animal advocates can have a real problem if they try, if you like, too early to get involved in the political system, which is deeply speciesist. And often what will happen, and this is quite an interesting thing that happens across the board, is animal rights gets translated into animal welfare. Example of that is circuses. You go outside a circus and you go, elephants have rights, animals have rights on that. They'll come out and go, our animals are well cared for, the ISPCA have been, and they've inspected the place and they think it's grand. And you go, I didn't say anything about welfare, I said animal rights. But it gets translated into animal welfare because that's really the only language that they can understand. The same goes for the political system. You talk to the political system about animal rights, it gets translated into animal welfare because you can't get animal rights through the political system that we've got now because it's too speciesist. You just get little bits and pieces, which is usually rubbish because they've been put together by speciesists in the first place. It's been argued through by, through that culture, and you end up with kind of stuff that's hardly worth, the paper it's written on. And then, because the culture's not changed, the people who are now banned do all they can to overturn it or to get around it. So in England, they found every loophole possible by which to continue hunting. It's said, I know some people would dispute this, it's said that more foxes now are being killed in England than before the hunt ban, because you can still kill them. It was never, the hunt ban was never about not killing foxes. There's no thing about it. It was about how you kill foxes. But even now, you can still set a pack onto a fox, so long as you don't kill the fox.
You're differentiating clearly, obviously, between the welfares and the rights. But would you not say that there is some trajectory, perhaps, that would you might see the animal welfare movement as a precursor to the animal rights movement? And often within radical movements, going back obviously to the original, kind of Menshevik Bolshevik split, the most conflict is often between at the fringe of a movement. Between people who are
from the outside, you can't tell the difference.
Yeah. So it can become like a kind of quite self-destructive thing when the sort of when there's a conflict between the welfares and I don't know.
Well, that's an interesting one because in modern advocacy, this is kind of being known as kind of foot in the door type stuff now. In other words, it's a little bit like get somebody to go meat free on a Monday. That's a foot in the door, and it could lead to vegetarianism, which could lead to veganism. It's that kind of incremental thing. So everybody expects incrementalism, and so therefore, a lot of people do say that it's just a continuum. And if you think of a spectrum, you can get animal rights at one end, you can get animal welfare and meat free Monday or whatever here, and you can kind of nudge people along to it. Now there are other people like Francione who would say that there are practical but also theoretical problems with that. Is the fact that they kind of contradict each other. In the sense that when you're working for animal welfare, you're kind of bolstering the entire paradigm which sees other animals as property, sees them as being part of the
but at least you're in a situation where there's you're raising the awareness.
That's the argument against Francione. What you say is that there are some people in society who have not thought morally about other animals at all.
Exactly, which is probably kind of the modernist.
Yeah, that's right. And so if you can get them to think on any level about it, then that's the foot in the door thing again. And you talk about cracks, that's
sure. And that's probably where a lot of people who possibly become vegan come from, is that they